The night began without intention, as most of my nights did then, with a sound, not an event. A small choir in St. Simeon's was rehearsing the Nunc Dimittis, and though I had no business there, I lingered at the edge of the cloister to listen. The cold had a clarity one rarely meets in Oxford, the kind that pairs sound to its essence. Every voice seemed suspended above the stone like breath that refused to fade. When the organ ceased, the silence had the shape of loss. I had walked that evening without purpose, that is, without one I could easily explain to myself. A habit of the solitary mind to move through beauty as if trespassing. Snow was beginning to fall again, the hesitant kind, uncertain whether it wished to settle. It gathered along the carved edges of the archways, bright against the age-blackened stone. A porter's lantern moved across the quadrangle, and I thought for a moment that he was looking for something. But perhaps he was merely closing gates. There is a certain melancholy that clings to Oxford after term ends. The students vanish, but their echoes remain faint laughter under the archways, cigarette ends crushed into old frost. I have always found the city most alive in its absences. That night I crossed the High without noticing the traffic light change and found myself outside the north wall of St. Simeon's. A sign there warned visitors that the grounds were closed after dusk. I remember smiling. Oxford had never struck me as a place that obeyed its own signs. It was there, by the locked gate of the cloister, that I saw him, or thought I did. A figure half concealed by the wall, stooping as if examining something in the snow. I called out, perhaps more sharply than I meant to. No reply. When I reached the spot, there was nothing, only footprints leading nowhere, dissolving as the snow thickened. I might have dismissed it a trick of shadow or imagination had I not noticed a faint indentation against the iron gate, as though a hand had pressed there, uncertainly, for balance. Later that evening, at home, I poured myself a small measure of Glenfiddich and turned on the radio. Bach again, mercifully. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in earnest, tapping softly at the window pane like a guest too polite to insist. I thought of the man in the cloister. Something about the angle of his head, the deliberateness of his posture. It was not curiosity I'd seen, but reluctance. A man stooping to hide something, or to retrieve what he had lost. I suppose it was then that the first unease began, the kind that doesn't announce itself as suspicion, but as unfinished thought, a sense that a note had been played out of tune, and I, fool that I am, have never been able to ignore dissonance. I tried to work it away with the crossword from the Times. The clue that caught me was silent witness, 6 letters. The answer came easily, and for a moment I almost laughed. I poured another whiskey and considered the symmetry of it all. Around 11, the church bells began to toll the hour, each chime softened by the weather. I remember thinking how sound, too, changes with snow. When it ceases to travel, it turns inward, as people do when cold or ashamed. I thought of the porter's lantern, the footprints that led to nothing, and the stillness that had followed the hymn. Some fragments of Latin drifted back to me from the evening's music. Nunc dimittis servum tuum. Domine, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. It should have been a comforting line. Instead, it felt like an epitaph, spoken too soon. I went to bed with that uneasy echo lodged somewhere behind the ribs, like the lingering vibration of a struck bell. Even now I sometimes wonder if I heard it wrong that night, or if, perhaps, it wasn't an ending at all, but the faint beginning of something that had already begun to die. The report came to me, as such things often did, by accident. A folded copy of the Oxford Mail abandoned on a seat of the number 17 bus, a faint ring of coffee on the corner of the front page. Senior fellow found dead in Cloister Garden, it said, as if death were a kind of academic appointment. Dr. Adrian Mallory of St. Simeon's College, aged 64, lecturer in theology, unmarried. Cause of death presumed heart failure during a solitary evening walk. I remember thinking that Oxford had a way of making even its tragedies sound routine, embalmed in civility. It was the smaller print beneath that drew me. A torn scrap of music found nearby, the report said, believed to have been in the deceased's possession. It was a curious inclusion. Newspapers seldom mention details so lightly unless someone insists. I knew the tone well enough, the cautious disclosure of an institution hoping to appear transparent while saying nothing of consequence. Still, I found myself keeping the paper, folding it into my coat pocket as though it were a letter meant for me. Lewis, when I mentioned it the next morning, raised an eyebrow and suggested that a man of Mallory's age and temperament might simply have overestimated his heart. He spoke cheerfully, almost apologetically, as if to remind me that not every death in Oxford needed a detective, but I couldn't shake a sense that something faintly discordant lay beneath the surface, the sort of unease one feels when hearing a familiar symphony played just a fraction too slowly. The coroner's report arrived later that day. I requested it on a whim, though whims, in my experience, are rarely innocent. Mallory's heart had indeed failed, but not cleanly. There were bruises along the wrist, a small abrasion near the temple. The doctor attributed them to the fall. I wasn't so sure. I've seen enough accidental deaths to know that some look rehearsed. When I visited St. Simeon's, the snow still lay across the cloister in pale ribbons, trodden thin by cautious footsteps. The porter, a man called Godfrey, met me at the gate. His eyes were redrimmed, not with grief but with cold or sleeplessness. He spoke little and with a stiffness that suggested rehearsal. The warden had asked him, he said, to keep visitors at a distance. The college was in mourning, and mourning in Oxford, I've noticed, is a private sport. I asked where Mallory had fallen. He pointed toward a bench beside the chapel wall, half hidden beneath an overhanging yew. I walked there alone. The bench was bare now, though a faint, dark patch in the snow marked the place where the body had lain. Something glimmered near the base of the wall, a fragment of white paper caught between frost and stone. I picked it up carefully. A scrap of manuscript, torn from a larger sheet. The ink blurred but legible enough to make out a few musical notes, and, beneath them, the faint trace of Latin words, ego sum echo. I turned the paper over, but there was nothing else. The cold had stiffened my fingers, and I felt an odd reluctance to pocket the fragment, as though I were intruding on a conversation meant for silence. The organ from the chapel began to sound then, tentative chords struggling against the chill. I recognized the piece as a variation from Tallis, unfinished, repeating the same progression without resolution. Perhaps that was what unsettled me, the sense that the music itself had been interrupted mid-breath. Lewis joined me later in the porter's lodge. Stamping the snow from his shoes, he asked what I thought of it. I told him it was too soon to think, but something about the phrase ego sum echo refused to leave my mind. An echo of what or of whom? He shrugged, content to let the question drift. Yet even as we left the college, I found myself looking back toward the cloister. The snow had begun to fall again, erasing the footprints one by one, until the garden looked as it must have looked the night before, untouched, immaculate, deceitfully pure. The porter had called them the Fellows, with a reverence that suggested they were less men than relics, preserved by the dust of their own scholarship. I met 3 that afternoon in the senior common room, where the air smelt faintly of coal smoke and something older, perhaps the unspoken resignation of men who had stayed too long in one place. The warden, Sir Julian Perrown, was first to greet me. His manner had the unctuous civility of someone who believes he has mastered discretion as a science. Behind him stood the bursar, Miss Harriet Dane, a woman of middle years with the expression of one accustomed to waiting for others to speak first. And then there was the organist, Edward Linton, whose thin fingers trembled faintly as he poured the sherry. They had arranged themselves as if for a portrait. Perrown near the fire, framed by dark paneling, Dane beside the window, half-lit by snow-light Linton slightly apart, as though unwilling to belong to any grouping that might later be described. They asked politely how the investigation progressed. I told them it hadn't yet begun. The warden smiled at that academic smile, cultivated to hide both relief and curiosity. Mallory, I said, seemed to have been a man both respected and avoided. Perrown nodded, saying that such a combination was the natural reward of intellectual purity. Dane added that he had few social ties outside his books. Linton, after some hesitation, murmured that Mallory had been kind enough to correct his Latin once or twice. His eyes darted toward the fire as he spoke, as if the flames might absolve him of something left unsaid. It was Miss Dane who poured the second glass. Her movements were steady, deliberate. I noticed the ring on her left hand was a dull silver band with a tiny crack along one edge. She caught my glance and said it was a relic from her mother. Perhaps it was, perhaps not. I have long believed that the most dangerous lies are those spoken truthfully. A silence settled then, broken only by the faint hiss of the radiator. It was Linton who filled it. He spoke of the upcoming memorial service and the choir's difficulty in finding the right tone for the Nunc Dimittis. He laughed softly at his own poutine and then apologized, unnecessarily. I told him that Mallory had been found with a torn fragment of music. Linton's smile faltered, just enough to notice. He said he had heard as much, though he seemed uncertain wherefrom. Perrown frowned at the intrusion of fact into the ceremony and declared that the college would prefer not to dwell on such morbid embellishments. As I left, the chapel door stood ajar. From within came the faint sound of rehearsal, a half-finished hymn unraveling into silence. I lingered by the threshold. The organ faltered, paused, then resumed in another key entirely. A modulation, perhaps accidental, yet it carried a melancholy precision that unsettled me. Linton was at the console, head bowed. I could see his reflection in the polished pipes doubled, distorted, like two men occupying the same sorrow. Later, Lewis remarked that I had stayed in the chapel longer than necessary. He asked what I had been listening for. I told him, perhaps more sharply than I intended, that music is never about sound. It is about what interrupts it. He looked at me in the puzzled way he always did when I drifted into abstraction, and I softened my tone. I said I'd noticed something small, an error in the Latin of the hymn book. The final line of the Nunc Dimittis read in Luce tua videbimus lumen. In thy light shall we see the light. But the printed text omitted the second lumen. A printer's oversight, perhaps, yet it seemed to echo the case itself, one light missing where two should have been. That evening, as we left St. Simeon's, the bells began their evening peal. Snow gathered along the parapets, indifferent to grief. I glanced back at the chapel's tall window, still faintly lit from within, and saw a figure moving behind the glass, slow, deliberate, almost spectral. Whether it was Linton or someone else, I couldn't say. Only that the movement seemed to follow the rhythm of a music I had not yet begun to hear. It was Lewis who found the envelope, though he would never have recognized its weight. He had been sifting through Mallory's desk in the porter's lodge routine, methodical and faintly apologetic about it. Among the brittle lecture notes and unpaid bills, the envelope lay tucked inside an old copy of The Cloud of Unknowing, its wax seal cracked, the paper yellowed to a faint ivory. The Latin address on the front was precise enough to suggest affection, though the script carried no signature. Inside were two things, a letter of only 4 lines and a faded photograph. The letter I read twice, perhaps 3 times. The words were impersonal, almost monastic in tone, but their restraint betrayed the tremor of intimacy. Ut amor taceat, memoria loquitur. When love falls silent, memory speaks. I showed it to Lewis, who shrugged. said it sounded like something from a gravestone, and went back to his paperwork. I envied him for his simplicity. There are men who can read words without hearing their echoes. The photograph was older than the letter. 3 young men in academic gowns, standing before a snow-covered cloister. One face, the one in the middle, had been crossed out with a single black line. Mallory was one of the others, lean, alert, faintly self-conscious, as if aware that happiness was something temporary. The third man I didn't yet know. The absence of the fourth face, the erased one, was more eloquent than the rest combined. There is a cruelty to ink when it is used not to record, but to deny. The college files were silent on the matter. No record of the photograph's date, no note of who might have taken it. But tucked into the same drawer was a small calling card embossed with the name Dr. Beatrice Lyle, college archivist. I made a mental note to visit her, though I already suspected that she too would prefer silence. Outside, Oxford had begun to thaw. Puddles formed beneath the stone arches, reflecting the pale faces of the gargoyles above. The air smelt of damp wool and distant fires. I walked toward Broad Street, the photograph in my pocket, and found myself wondering how easily friendship curdles in the cold. In my time, I've seen affection turn to envy in quieter places than this. At the King's Arms, Lewis tried to persuade me that the picture was merely sentimental, an academic relic, nothing more. But the human heart rarely archives without purpose. Someone had meant for that envelope to be found, or perhaps never to be found at all. It was the kind of uncertainty that suited Oxford, everything half confession, half concealment. As Lewis fetched another round, I unfolded the photograph again. The snow in it was too bright, too clean. It seemed to erase rather than preserve. And then I noticed something I had missed before, the faint outline of a fourth shadow on the ground, beside the 3 men, extending just beyond the edge of the frame. Whoever took the picture had stood closer than a casual observer. The fourth shadow had the shape of a woman's figure, long coat, narrow shoulders, a witness unrecorded. Back at my flat that night, I placed the photo on my desk beneath the lamplight. I stared at the crossed-out face, wondering not who it was, but why it mattered so much to remove him. Perhaps the ink had been drawn in anger or remorse, or both. The letter's final line returned to memory, and I thought about how memory, once awakened, rarely speaks kindly. I turned to the crossword to quiet the mind. The clue that held me read, "Image, once altered, conceals truth 5. The answer, of course, was erase. I wrote it in, slowly, and felt the peculiar satisfaction of recognition. Some truths are less uncovered than mirrored. When I looked up, the photograph had caught the reflection of my lamp, casting a pale ring of light across the erased face. For an instant, it looked as though the missing man were trying, hopelessly, to return. The archives of St. Simeon's lay beneath the library, behind a door that moaned as though reluctant to open. I had arranged to meet Dr. Beatrice Lyle there, though I could not have said why I expected her to be young. She wasn't. Or rather, she was of that indeterminate age peculiar to women whose lives have been spent among the dust of old paper and the company of ghosts. Her voice had the measured calm of someone long accustomed to the silences of others. "You're looking for Dr. Mallory's research," she said, not quite asking. I told her I was looking for what he might have misplaced. The distinction amused her, faintly. The room was narrow and low, the air thick with the smell of parchment and damp. Shelves rose in uneven ranks, sagging beneath the weight of catalogued memory. A single bulb hung above us, its light trembling with the draught. She moved gracefully through the maze of cabinets, brushing her fingers along the labels as if touching the years themselves. Mallory's work, she said, was mostly theological, though he dabbled in musicology, a dangerous combination if you believed in blasphemy through beauty. He had been studying a medieval hymn, Cantus Nevergelis. Few dared to translate it. The church had declared it heretical centuries ago. He found the notion romantic, she added, and gave me a look that left me uncertain whether she meant the hymn or the heresy. She opened a drawer and withdrew a folder, tied with a faded ribbon. Inside were scattered notes, smudged margins, and an incomplete transcription of a score. Along one edge, I noticed faint modern pencil marks, ego sum echo. I am the echo. The phrase had followed me like a shadow since Mallory's death, though here it felt less theological than personal. I asked her what she thought of it. An indulgence, perhaps, she said softly. Mallory was a man in love with reflection. He never met a mirror he didn't trust. There was something in her tone, not disdain, not quite affection, a residue of understanding that only the disillusioned possess. I asked if she had known him well. She adjusted the ribbon, avoiding my eyes. Everyone who worked with him knew him well in his way. He listened only to what confirmed his solitude. A strange answer, but it lingered. She turned to return the folder, and I noticed the way her hand trembled slightly, enough to ruffle the paper, but not enough to betray emotion. Some gestures, I've learned, speak in a dialect the voice cannot manage. We talked about the hymn again. She said Mallory had believed the music contained a code hidden in its intervals, a message disguised within harmony. I told her that men have destroyed themselves over less persuasive mysteries. She smiled, though not at me. It isn't the mystery that destroys, she said. It's the need to end it. I asked if she had seen him in the days before his death. Only once, in the cloister, she said, and then, after a pause, added that he seemed distracted, as if waiting to be forgiven for something he hadn't yet done. Her phrasing startled me. Guilt imagined in advance is rarely innocent. When I pressed her, she withdrew behind the armor of scholarship, producing a catalogue card as though the conversation had been a filing error. If you're interested in his final papers, she said, they're listed under unclassified fragments. I took the card, though I already knew it would yield little. As I left, she followed me to the door. The light above us flickered again, and for a moment the years fell away. She seemed almost fragile, as if she herself might be one of the college's relics, valued, admired, and quietly fading. When I thanked her, she said something so low I almost missed it. Truth, Inspector, is like parchment. Hold it too close to the flame and it disappears. Outside, the rain had begun to fall soft, persistent, cleansing nothing. I paused on the steps, the phrase still echoing. Ego sum echo. I am the echo. And for the first time, I wondered whether the voice repeating it was not Mallory's at all, but hers. The gardener's name was Ellis, a man of the old Oxford sort, wool cap, thin patience, and an air of permanent apology for having survived so long among academics. He told us, without embellishment, that he'd seen 2 sets of footprints in the cloister garden before dawn. One pair lighter, smaller, leading toward the chapel gate. The other, heavier, returning alone. He said he'd thought nothing of it. He was paid to tend the living, not to question the dead. Lewis asked if he could remember the spacing of the steps, the depth of the impressions. Ellis shook his head, but I noticed the way he hesitated before saying no, as if recalling something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the footprints themselves that had troubled him, it was their silence. Fresh snow makes a sound when walked upon, a faint, crisp sigh, and he swore he had heard none. He described it as though the figures had been moving through another world entirely, one where sound refused to follow. We walked the path together that afternoon, retracing what remained. The thaw had begun, and the prints were dissolving into pools of water that reflected the pale sky like fragments of a broken mirror. I bent to examine one near the gate, a partial heel mark. Lewis muttered that they could belong to anyone. I told him perhaps they did, though I doubted anyone walked here without reason. A college garden in midwinter is not a place for accidents. Inside the chapel, the choir was rehearsing again, the sound filtered through stone and distance. The same hymn as before Nunc Dimittis, though the phrasing was different, slower, almost hesitant. The organist, Linton, stood beside the console, murmuring to the boys between verses. When he saw us, he straightened, smiled too quickly, and began to close his sheet music. I told him we were revisiting the scene, but he seemed already aware. There are faces that give themselves away, not by fear, but by readiness. The guilty often rehearse their innocence too well. He spoke about Mallory in tones that aspired to reverence but fell short of affection. A fine scholar, he said, though perhaps too fond of secrets. I asked what secrets he meant. Linton avoided my gaze, tracing the edge of the organ keys with one finger. Ideas, he said vaguely. The sort that drives a man to solitude. I could have pressed him, but there are questions that die the moment they are voiced. I left him to his silence and studied the hymn book on the stand. The page had been turned down at the corner, though not at the Nunc Dimittis. The folded leaf marked a different piece entirely, Miserere me. Have mercy upon me. A small detail, easily overlooked, yet its quiet plea seemed to echo through the nave long after the boys had gone. Outside, the snow thickened again. Lewis walked ahead, muttering about the senselessness of poetry and police work. I told him that sense is often the enemy of understanding, though he laughed and said I'd been spending too much time among theologians. Perhaps he was right. Still, something in the pattern of the footprints lingered in my mind, the way one set had pressed deeper, as if carrying a burden, while the other had barely touched the ground. Weight and weightlessness, guilt and grace. A paradox in snow. At the gate, I paused. The iron was cold beneath my glove, and there, faint but unmistakable, was a smear of red along the latch, not blood, but rust newly disturbed. Someone had gripped it recently, perhaps in haste. I brushed the mark with my thumb. Beneath the rust lay a trace of wax, pale and brittle, the kind used to seal envelopes. For a moment I thought of Mallory's letter, the broken seal, the handwriting in Latin. I said nothing to Lewis. Some discoveries prefer their own silence. As dusk fell, the college bells began to toll again, their sound dimmed by snow. I looked back once toward the cloister. The footprints were already gone, erased by the night's soft insistence. And yet I knew, as surely as one knows the echo of a voice unseen, that something had passed there, something that refused to vanish, however deep the snow. The boy couldn't have been more than 13. Pale, freckled, his hair the uncertain color of damp straw. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the nave, hands buried in his cassock pockets as if he were hiding something fragile. Lewis had found him waiting after practice, hesitant to speak but too burdened by what he'd heard to stay silent. It was his eyes that drew me first. Not frightened precisely, but shadowed by the knowledge of something that would never again be simple. He said he had been locked up after rehearsal on the night Dr. Mallory died. Snow was falling, and the other boys had gone. He'd lingered, he said, because he liked the way the organ sounded when the building was empty. He'd heard voices in the cloister, then a man and a woman, arguing softly, though the words were blurred by the wind. Only one word had carried clearly across the stone forgive. He thought it was the woman who'd said it, though he couldn't be sure. He had meant to look, but a door slammed somewhere behind him, and by the time he gathered courage, the voices had gone. Lewis asked if he recognized either of them. The boy shook his head, then hesitated. He thought one of the voices sounded like Dr. Mallory's, but softer than usual, as if the man were pleading. When I asked about the woman, his answer came so quietly that I almost missed it. He thought it might have been the archivist. He'd heard her speak once in the chapel and remembered her tone. Not the words, just the calmness. I thanked him and told him to forget what he could. But forgetting, I've learned, is rarely a choice. We left him with the verger, who promised to walk him home. Outside, the air was bright with flurries, the kind that seemed to rise rather than fall. Lewis said the boy might be mistaken. I said he almost certainly was, though I didn't believe it. There is a quality in certain recollections of a timbre, like music that cannot be invented. The memory of sound is deeper than the memory of sight. Later that evening, I returned to St. Simeon's. The chapel was empty, save for the lingering scent of candle wax and something faintly metallic, like old blood or iron. I sat in the back pew listening to the hush. I thought again of that word forgive and how it had traveled through the snow like a signal meant for no one. I remembered Beatrice Lyle's composure in the archive, her careful economy of movement. It is often the calmest voices that carry the sharpest echoes. The organ loomed in shadow, the pipes catching stray glints of light from the street beyond. On the music stand lay an open score, Miserere Mei, the same pieces marked in Linton's hymn book. I traced the edge of the page. The notes were smudged by what looked like damp fingers. I couldn't help wondering whose. The boys' rehearsals rarely included this work. I'd asked the choir master earlier in the week, and he'd told me it hadn't been performed in months. Yet the page was worn, recently turned. At the back of the chapel, near the vestry door, the snow had seeped in under the threshold, melting into a thin, dark pool. Someone had stood there not long ago. A single footprint remained small or narrow, probably a woman's shoe. I crouched beside it, tracing its outline with my torchlight. The sole carried the faint imprint of a nail, the kind used in handmade heels. I remembered, without meaning to, the sound Beatrice's shoes had made on the archive floor, not loud, but distinct, like punctuation in a whisper. Lewis found me there an hour later and asked what I thought it meant. I told him nothing yet, though my mind was already working through the shape of it. A quarrel, a word half heard, the misstep of a heel in snow. He sighed and said he'd fetch us both a drink. I nodded. As he left, the last of the light faded from the window and the silence drew in close, so complete it seemed almost kind. In that silence, I could still hear the boy's voice repeating the word as if trying to understand its weight. Forgive. Edward Linton was waiting in the chapel when we arrived, standing beside the organ as though caught mid-performance. His coat was draped over a pew, a gesture that suggested both belonging and flight. The light through the stained glass had the fragile color of old wine, and for a moment I thought the whole room was holding its breath. He greeted us with the bright civility of a man who has rehearsed the occasion. I asked whether he might spare a few minutes. He said, of course, though his eyes flicked once to the door, like a creature measuring distance. He spoke of Mallory's music with a scholar's affection, even admiration. The professor, he said, had been attempting to reconstruct a lost choral sequence, a work that blurred the line between devotion and doubt. Linton smiled faintly when he said this, as though the notion pleased him more than it should. I asked if he desisted. He hesitated, then admitted to copying out some of the notations. A simple task, he called it, though there was nothing simple in his tone. I wondered how much guilt can hide beneath a musician's precision. Lewis, kind as ever, remarked that Linton must find solace in such work. The organist's smile stiffened. Solace is a word, he said, that sounds gentler than it feels. I noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted the stops. It was not fear, exactly, but the tremor of someone who knows the world can no longer be tuned to his liking. He began to play then, without asking, a phrase from the Miserere Mei, hesitant, uneven, the melody limping where it should have soared. Lewis looked at me, uncertain. I let it continue. After a minute, Linton stopped and rested his hands on the keys. Mallory corrected that very passage, he murmured. Said I'd misunderstood the harmony. I asked if that had angered him. No, he said, but I think he was wrong. The music wanted dissonance. Harmony is a lie we tell ourselves to make discord bearable. There was something almost tender in the way he said it, and I felt absurdly a kind of pity. Men destroy themselves not from cruelty, but from the wish to create beauty without blemish. He confessed, after a silence, that he had forged part of the score. Not maliciously, he insisted merely to test an idea. Mallory found out the night before he died. There had been an argument. Words spoken too sharply. He looked down at his hands as though they were no longer entirely his. I asked what was said. He repeated one sentence almost inaudibly. You cannot repair a hymn by deceit. Then, more quietly, he said he would expose me. The sound of the word expose hung in the air like a sour note. Lewis shifted, uneasy. I watched Linton's reflection in the pipes, a faint double image, as if one part of him still played while the other listened in shame. I asked how the argument ended. He said Mallory walked away. Into the cloister, I think. It was snowing. His voice trembled on the word snow, as though he still stood beneath it. I asked if he followed. He shook his head, but too quickly, the denial already anticipating disbelief. I wondered if the truth was chasing him still, always half a step behind. When we left, the air outside was colder than before, the kind of cold that sharpens thought. Lewis said he was lying, and perhaps he was. But lies, like music, have variations, some meant to conceal, others to confess. As we walked through the quadrangle, I glanced back toward the chapel window. Linton was playing again, the sound faint but relentless, as though repetition might erase the wrong note. The melody faltered once more at the same bar, resolving too neatly, too soon. It struck me then the harmony he'd altered in Mallory's score had not been a mistake at all. The original progression, imperfect and unresolved, had carried truth. Linton's correction, his sockled improvement, had ruined it. I said nothing to Lewis. We passed the porter's gate without a word, and the bells began to toll for evensong. Each note is clear, symmetrical, and utterly false. It was Lewis who found the connection first, though he never realized it. He'd been grumbling about the Latin inscription on the hymn fragment, wondering aloud what kind of man spends his last moments surrounded by words no one else can read. I told him that men like Mallory rarely expect to be understood in life or in death. They write to themselves, not to the world. He said it sounded lonely. I said it was. The phrase, ego sum echo, had haunted me since that first day. It had turned up in Mallory's notes, in the torn sheet of music, even in Beatrice Lyle's hesitant explanation in the archive. Yet I'd been looking at it too literally. I'd treated it as meaning, when it was, in fact, structured. A cipher. I saw it, finally, while waiting for the kettle to boil, tracing the letters on a notepad beside the crossword. The pattern of vowels formed a sequence E-O-U-E-O. Musically, those notes could correspond to a simple pentatonic scale, but rearranged, they echoed the motif that Linton had played in his false harmony. Coincidence, perhaps, but Oxford has taught me never to trust coincidences that flatter the ear. I spent the afternoon in the archive again. Beatrice was there, though she seemed unsurprised by my arrival. She had abandoned the formalities of her profession, her cardigan loose, her hair drawn back without care. She looked like someone who had outlived her own pretense of indifference. I asked whether Mallory had ever spoken to her of the hymn's code. She smiled faintly, a gesture that contained both weariness and defiance. Codes, she said, were Mallory's way of justifying concealment. He didn't believe in revelation, only discovery. I asked what he wanted to discover. Her silence was almost tender. I took the fragment from my pocket and placed it on the table. Ego sum echo, I said quietly. You must know what it means. Her gaze flickered to the page, then to me. The light in the archive was thin, winter-strained, falling across her face in a way that revealed both guilt and grace. She said she'd copied those words once, long ago, into the margin of a paper Mallory had supervised. It was a private joke between them, or perhaps not a joke at all. It meant more than she had intended, as words so often do. I asked her why he had kept it. She said he kept everything, even the things he should have burned. There was a tremor in her voice now, the kind that comes not from fear but from the exhaustion of postponing truth. I asked if she'd seen him on the night he died. She nodded once. He had summoned her to the cloister. There had been a disagreement, she said, about her work, her reputation, and something she'd done in her thesis that Mallory had realized was not entirely her own. She told him it was borrowed, not stolen. He refused to see the difference. She looked down at her hands, folded too tightly in her lap. I didn't mean to harm him, she whispered. He slipped, he fell. But when I reached him, he was already gone. Outside, the bells of St. Simeon's began to toll for vespers, their sound faintly distorted by the rain. I watched her rise, the movement fragile but unhurried. She said that Mallory had loved her once, though love for him was an act of classification, something to be named, indexed, and forgotten. She had written ego sum echo as a kind of warning. I am your echo. I reflect, I repeat, but I am not yours. It was the only truth she could offer him. I left her there among the shelves, the hymn still lying between us like a confession without a priest. Lewis met me outside and asked if she'd told me anything useful. I said yes, though I doubted he would understand how little that word meant. As we walked away, the rain eased and the last bell struck its note. For a moment, it sounded almost like an answer. Then it faded, as all echoes do, into the silence that created them. I remember that evening with a clarity that feels undeserved. The air above Oxford hung thick with frost, and the bells of St. Simeon's had already begun their slow, uneven tolling. They were not quite in tune. That, more than anything, stayed with me. Even the bells, those ancient arbiters of time and devotion, had faltered. Lewis and I waited in the cloister, our breath clouding in front of us, our silence as brittle as the ice that had gathered along the flagstones. She came as she had promised Beatrice Lyle, archivist, scholar, penitent. She moved like someone walking toward a verdict long since written. Her coat was buttoned to the throat, though her hands trembled in the open air. I told her there was still time to reconsider. She said, almost gently, that reconsideration had been the cause of all her delays. We stood beneath the bell tower, the sound above us reverberating through the stone like the heart of some weary god. She spoke without embellishment. Mallory had called her there that night, she said, to threaten exposure to plagiarism, forged citations and fragments borrowed from his own research. She had pleaded, of course, not for forgiveness, but for mercy of silence. He refused. There had been anger, then despair, then a sudden, brutal stillness. He had slipped on the snow. She had not meant to let him fall, but her hand had caught his arm, and then his sleeve, and then nothing. He was gone before the echo of his name could reach the wall. She paused, eyes lifted toward the sound of the bells, and I realized that what she sought now was not absolution, but acknowledgement, the small, terrible dignity of being seen. I asked if she had moved the body. She nodded. She had dragged him beneath the archway, wiped the rail where his hand had struck, and placed the torn hymn beside him. The phrase ego sum echo had been her invention once, but she said Mallory had taken it for his own, turning her private lament into a mark of possession. She wanted him to see, even in death, that she was more than his reflection. Lewis shifted beside me, uneasy. I told him to fetch the car, though I knew I was buying her one last moment of solitude. She thanked me not with words, but with that strange, quiet look people give when gratitude and grief have become indistinguishable. I said she could have come forward sooner. She replied that she had tried. In every sleepless night, in every note of that cursed hymn, she had confessed a little. When Lewis returned, I walked her to the gate. She did not resist. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and deliberate, erasing even the sound of our steps. The porter's lantern flickered in the distance like a star, with no purpose left. I told her the college would manage its scandal with discretion Oxford always did. She smiled, not with pride, but with the tired recognition of one who knows how stories end. As they led her away, the bells struck the final note, deep and lingering, rolling across the rooftops like a slow release of breath. I stood alone in the cloister for a long time after, staring at the imprint her shoes had left in the snow. The shape of each step was so careful, almost symmetrical, as though even guilt demanded grace. Later at home, I poured a small whiskey and stared at the hymn on my desk. The ink had bled through the paper in places, the Latin barely legible. I traced the words once with my finger. Ego sum echo cordis tui, I am the echo of your heart. Perhaps it was Mallory's final taunt. Perhaps it was hers. The truth, like music, changes depending on who is listening. Outside, the bells resumed their practice, striving for harmony. They would never quite find it, I knew, but they kept trying, and in that there was something almost merciful. I opened the bottle out of habit rather than celebration. A modest Bordeaux, left too long on its side, its cork soft with years. The label bore a date I couldn't quite read, and that seemed fitting. There are vintages, like people, whose precise age no longer matters. The flat was quiet, that strange, expansive silence that follows the closing of a case. It is not a relief. It is an absence shaped like relief. I poured a small measure and sat by the window. The street lamps outside glowed faintly through the mist, smearing the city's geometry into suggestion. I could just make out the spire of St. Simeon's, distant and still. Somewhere behind those stones lay the residue of confession and the echo of bells. Oxford, indifferent as ever, had folded its scandal neatly back into routine. The paper that morning had carried a short column, College Archivist, charged after death inquiry. I read it once, without reaction. It was written with the peculiar politeness of English condemnation. Lewis had called earlier. He said the evidence was tidy. The fingerprint on the hymn fragment, the witness accounts, the motive. All the things that make for closure. He asked if I was satisfied. I told him, satisfaction is not a word that belongs to our profession. He said I ought to take a holiday. Somewhere warm. I promised I would consider it. We both knew I wouldn't. I looked again at the photograph from Mallory's desk of the three young men in snow, one face crossed out. Beneath the lamplight, the inked line looked almost like a scar healing over the past. I'd meant to return it to the college, but something in me resisted. Perhaps I wanted to keep a fragment of imperfection, or perhaps, as with most things, I simply delayed the inevitable. The crossword lay open on the table beside me. The clue that caught my eye read, wine shared among friends, yet half forgotten. 6. I stared at it, longer than necessary before writing claret. It fit, though the word felt heavier than the sum of its letters. The glass in my hand had grown warm, the color deepening to something between blood and memory. I drank it slowly, though each swallow seemed to taste of guilt rather than grape. I thought of Beatrice Lyle, her composure, her measured tone, her refusal to beg. There had been dignity in her ruin, which disturbed me more than her crime. I imagined her cell, the quiet ritual of hours marked without bells. I wondered if she still remembered the hymn, or if its melody had dissolved into that kind of silence that only the condemned understood. Some part of me envied her certainty. The rest pitied it. The clock on the mantel struck 9. Its sound seemed out of place, too bright for the room. I found myself thinking of Mallory's last lecture, the misquoted line from Milton that had bothered me since I'd first read it. To justify the ways of God to man. He had written purify instead of justify. I had dismissed it as fatigue, but now it seemed deliberate. Purify. He had sought moral cleansing, not divine explanation. Perhaps that is what Beatrice had given him in the end. A kind of purification through destruction. Oxford breeds that sort of irony. The wine was nearly finished. I held the glass up to the light and watched the sediment gather like silt at the bottom. Outside, the rain began soft, persistent, curiously gentle. I thought of the cloister, of snow melting over stone, of a word whispered by a dying man and repeated by a woman who no longer believed in mercy. Forgive. Such an easy word to say, such a difficult one to mean. I closed the bottle and turned off the lamp. The city lay in darkness, except for a single glimmer from the college tower, a candle left burning in an upper room. Perhaps a student, working late, unaware that his walls once held the weight of tragedy. Or perhaps not. Oxford keeps its ghosts well fed. I drank the last of the claret, tasted its quiet bitterness, and thought how every ending I've ever known has sounded so much like peace, and nothing at all like it. I went back to St. Simeon's a week later. Habit, I told myself, though habit in my line of work often disguises a kind of mourning. The snow had vanished by then, leaving behind only the memory of its precision, every mark softened, every edge undone. Oxford looked as it always did after a storm, too composed to admit it had ever been disturbed. Lewis had finished the paperwork the day before. His tone on the telephone was brisk, almost cheerful. All done and dusted, he'd said, though neither word sits comfortably with death. I told him I wanted one more walk through the grounds. He offered to come. I said no. There are endings a man should arrive at alone. The porter let me in without question. The cloister smelled of thawing earth and cold stone, a scent that always makes me think of forgotten chapels. A maintenance man was sweeping away. The grit, and I watched him for a while, the slow rhythm of his broom, the neat path he cleared, the erasure of what had once been evidence. He nodded when he saw me, uncertain whether to speak. I nodded back, and that seemed enough. I followed the path to the bench where Mallory had fallen. The yew above it dripped steadily, one dark bead of water at a time. Nothing to suggest tragedy now, only the faint indent of where the snow had once settled unevenly, the last shape of an absence. A robin hopped along the wall and regarded me with the frank curiosity of something too small to understand guilt. I envied its ignorance. Inside the chapel, the air was cool and faintly metallic, still carrying a trace of candle wax. The choir stalls were empty. The hymn books, stacked neatly at the end of each pew, looked like a congregation of unopened confessions. I stood by the organ for a long time, running my hand along the keys without pressing them, so the dust came away on my fingertips like ash. Somewhere above, a bell shifted in its socket, giving a single, uncertain note. The echo reminded me of that night, the boy's voice, the quarrel, the words that hung between them like a suspended cord. Forgive. It is a strange word for a policeman to consider. We deal in guilt, not grace. Yet I have never been sure where one ends and the other begins. Beatrice Lyle had spoken her truth as though it were an argument she had already lost. Mallory's righteousness had driven him to the edge of pity. Between them lay the oldest story in the world, the hunger to be right and the loneliness that follows. I found myself tracing the carvings along the choir rail, saints, scholars, anonymous benefactors. each face worn smooth by time, their identities reduced to patience. One of the figures, I noticed, held a small open book. Beneath it, half hidden by polish, an inscription in Latin, Sola Memoria Manei. Only memory remains. It was the same hand that had carved the line above the door to the archive. I hadn't seen it before, or perhaps I hadn't wished to. When I stepped back into the courtyard, the sun had begun to sink behind the tower. The stones glowed briefly, as if remembering light. Near the gate, the gardener's broom had left one patch untouched, a small oval of damp earth shaped almost like a footprint. I paused there, uncertain whether to disturb it. The human impulse, after all, is to preserve what we cannot repeat. Then the wind shifted, and a few dead leaves swept across the mark, erasing it in seconds. I let them. I left the college without speaking to anyone. The porter nodded again, less curious now, and closed the gate behind me. On the pavement outside, students hurried past with books pressed to their chests, their laughter echoing faintly against the walls. I watched them until the sound faded. The city had already moved on, as it always does, leaving me to carry what little remained. That night, back in my flat, I poured the last of the easy claret. It tasted dull, oxidized like something that had outlived its purpose. I stood by the window a while, looking down at the street where the snow had once lain, and thought how strange it is that even footprints, the most human of marks, are destined to disappear precisely because we keep walking.